Hey everybody. I was waiting for the recording to count down, so um, I was distracted for a minute. Good evening. Tonight, what we are going to talk about is mainly about the ladies. We have last week we talked about industrialization. We're going to move on into the age of democracy and progress. This is about 1815 to 1914. That's kind of the unit that we're talking about. And we're going to focus mainly on Britain and the Victorian age. And this is important to us because, us meaning us Americans, because a lot of our traditions come from the Victorian age. Our Santa Claus and some of the things that traditions that we hold actually began in this age, so in this time period. So we're going to be looking at Britain and how they adopted some democratic reforms. I'll go ahead and change my slide here. Okay, so talking about urbanization and industrialization. So this is going to bring some different changes to some of the Western nations. People are starting to look for solutions to problems that were created by industrialization. And they're going to demand reforms. They want to improve conditions for workers and the poor. Many people also begin to call for political reforms. They demand that ordinary people be given a greater voice in government. So, as you well know, by this time, Britain is a constitutional monarchy, okay? And remember what that is. That means that the monarchy is granted its powers by the Constitution, that country's constitution, and not by some divine right. So this had happened back in the 1600s. It remains the same today. So under the system of government, monarchs serve as the head of the state, but it's Parliament that holds control, that holds the real power. The British Parliament consisted of the House of Lords and House of Commons, and members of the House of Lords either inherit their seats or are appointed. The House of Commons are elected by the British people. So in the early 1800s, the British government was not a true democracy. Only about 6% of the population had the right to elect members to the House of Commons. Voting was limited to men who owned a substantial amount of land. Women could not vote at all. As a result of the upper classes, the upper classes ran the government. So during the 1800s, democracy gradually expanded in Great Britain. The ideas of liberalism that were popular in France and other countries spread among Britain's growing middle class and working classes. These groups demanded a greater share of the power held by aristocratic landowners. Yet, unlike the French, the British achieved reforms without any kind of war or bloodshed. The French went through a French Revolution, but the British did not. Okay, so the first one was the Reform Bill of 1832. This group demanded greater voice in politics. This was the wealthy middle class, factory owners, bankers, merchants, these types of people. Beginning in 1830, protests took place around England in favor of the bill in Parliament that would extend suffrage or the right to vote. Around the Revolution of 1830 in France frightened parliamentary leaders. They feared that a revolution and violence would spread into Britain. Thus, Parliament passes the Reform Bill of 1832, which didn't eliminate, but eased the property requirements so that well-to-do men in the middle class could vote. The Reform Bill also modernized the districts for electing members of Parliament. Many of the old districts were areas owned by aristocrats and actually contained very few people. So in contrast, cities such as Manchester and Sheffield had no representation in Parliament at all. So the Reform Bill eliminated the so-called rotten boroughs. That's what they were termed. Or empty districts, and gave the thriving new industrial cities more representation. Okay, Workers, although start to demand suffrage. Although the Reform Bill increased the number of British voters, of only about 1 in 5 men were now eligible to vote. So the passage of the bill, however, encouraged reformers among the workers and other groups who could still not vote. And actually, you know what? I'm going to pull this up real quick because it's good. It's just good. Nope, not that. Hold on. I think I can maybe share my screen and you'll may be able to see this. Hold on. Oh, I can't share my screen. I'll do it later. No, I'll do it now. Okay, so if I shared my screen. Share screen. Share. There we go. Desktop. Okay. I just really wanted to. This became a lot more trouble than it was worth. This is really what I wanted to show you. Don't judge me by my cluttered up desktop. Okay. So this is just kind of, as I'm going through talking about the workers, you can kind of see who had the right to vote and who did not. So among the workers and other groups who could still not vote, a popular movement arose to press for more rights. It was called the Chartists movement because the group first presented its demands to Parliament on a petition called the People's Charter of 1838. So it calls for suffrage for all men and annual parliamentary elections. It also proposed reform in Parliament in other ways. In Britain at the time, eligible men openly voted by voice. Since the vote was not secret, they could feel pressure to vote in a certain way. Also, members of Parliament had to own land and receive no salary, so they needed to be independently wealthy. The Chartists, people who wanted the right to vote, wanted to make Parliament more responsive to the interests of the lower classes. To achieve this, they demanded a secret ballot. Parliament rejected the Chartists' demands. However, their protest convinced many people that workers had some legitimate complaints. Over the years, workers continued to press for political reforms, and Parliament eventually responded. It gave the vote to working class men in 1867 and to male rural workers, farmers, sheep herders, more likely, in 1884. After 1884, therefore, most adult males in Britain had the right to vote. By the early 1900s, all demands of the Chartists, except for the annual elections, became law. We're talking about men too, not women. Ladies, not you yet. Let's see if I can bring back up what I was looking, I was doing this right here. Okay, stop sharing. All right, hold on 1 second. Let me get this and go back to our presentation. I hope y'all were able to see that okay. Okay, if not, I'll post the chart in the class. Okay, so the Victorian age. So the person who presided over all of this historic change was Queen Victoria. We'll see a picture of her in just a second. She came to the throne in 1837. At the age of 18, she was queen for 64 years. Our queen, Great Britain's queen, Queen Elizabeth, just surpassed her reign. She's reigned for more than 64 years, excuse me. One of the longest reigns in history, no longer. During the Victorian age, the British Empire reached the height of its wealth and power. She was popular. I'll go ahead and change my slide because I want you to see her. I want you to see. There she is. During the Victorian Age, the British Empire reached the height of its wealth and power. Victoria was popular with her subjects, and she performed her duties wisely and capably. However, she was forced to accept a new, virtually powerless role for the British monarchy. Kings who preceded Victoria in the 1700s and 1800s had exercised great influence over Parliament. The spread of democracy in the 1800s shifted political power almost completely to Parliament, especially to the elected House of Commons. Now, the government was completely run by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. Thus, ever since Queen Victoria, British monarchs have mainly been symbolic rulers with no political power. So by 1890, several countries had universal male suffrage, the right for all males to vote. No country, however, allowed women to vote. As more men gained suffrage, more women demanded the same. British women also wanted the right to vote, to organize and reform. So let's take a look at Victoria. So 3 years after her coronation, that's where she gets her crown and officially becomes the queen. She fell in love with her cousin, a distant cousin, Albert, who was a German prince. She proposed to him, and they were married in 1840. Together, they had 9 children. He was very straight-laced. He established a tone of polite propriety at court, and the royal couple presented a picture of a loving family that became the British ideal. Albert died in 1861. The Queen wore black for the rest of her life because she was in mourning. She once said of Albert, "Without him, everything loses its interest." That's kind of sad. Let's move on. All right, so let's take a look at Victorian life. Okay. So tea, mind your tea and cakes. Taking tea, afternoon tea, about 5 p.m. has become as English as London fog. But tea drinkers should be careful to buy supplies only from reputable sources. Some so-called tea merchants and coloring to convert. Some tea merchants added coloring to convert blackthorn leaves into something that looks like tea. In London, several factories dyed recycled tea leaves for dishonest merchants to sell via tea. Be careful, too, about those cakes you serve at your tea. To get the brightest colors to decorate cakes, some dishonest bakers use dangerous chemicals, copper, zinc to get gold and silver, iron for blue, and lead for red. Even arsenic sometimes was sprinkled on for green. So, yes, high tea is very important there in Britain. Cholera. Okay, so cholera comes from bad water. Dr. John Snow publishes a revised edition of his 1849 pamphlet titled "On the Mode of Communication of Cholera." In this pamphlet, he uses case examples to show that contaminated drinking water caused the cholera epidemics that kills thousands of poor Londoners. His critics scorned that his theory, maintaining that cholera spreads from the air that surrounds the rubbish heaps. Cholera is a huge problem. So if you wanted to travel in London mid-19th century, quickly and cheaply, it's the new improved British railways that you will take. Regular trains speed you to your destination in about 20 minutes. An hour on express routes, you'll whiz through at nearly 40 miles per hour. Here are some tips for traveling. Bring your own candles if you intend to read at night. Prepare to rent a metal foot warmer if you're taking a winter journey. Bring your own food to prepare to brave the crowds at the station restaurants. Along journeys, take a tote. For long journeys, you should bring your own chamber pot. That's because there's no public restrooms, folks. So there you go, there. So what you see here is the Paddington Station in 1855. I added a picture of Paddington Station today because, well, let's face it hasn't really changed a whole lot. Well, we have electric lights now, and not candle-lit lights. But, you know, the big dome shapes, those stay the same. Okay, and then, let's see, lastly, I want to talk about Victorian manners. Victorian manners are an important part of culture. For the gentleman, a proper gentleman will let the lady walk or ride along the wall, never along in the side of the street. Never speaks to a lady unless she speaks to him first. Precedes a lady walking upstairs and follows one walking downstairs. Takes the backward-facing seat in a carriage and gets out first to help the lady out. And a proper gentleman never smokes in front of a lady. The proper lady never walks alone or never walks unchaperoned if she is unmarried and under 30. Does not go out alone to make a social call on a man. No. Never wears pearls or diamonds in the morning. And never dances more than 3 dances with the same partner. Shame on you if you do. Okay. So that concludes my presentation about the Victorian era. Think about some of the different examples that I talked about, particularly that demonstrate popular culture in Victorian England, both admired as a tradition and change. So next week, we will be moving on as we move through this the 19th century. If you ever have any questions or need any additional information, please feel free to reach out. Thank you for listening.